They mocked her swollen belly. They spat on her dignity. And on the coldest night of her life, they threw her into the rain as if she was nothing. But that same black pregnant woman would one day raise a son who would bring justice crashing down on the very man who humiliated her. This is Maya Johnson's story, and the legacy of her son, Isaiah. The rain poured heavy that night, drenching the shining lights of the Langford Hotel in a slick glow. The red carpet was rolled out for an exclusive gala, where laughter and champagne flowed. It was the kind of place where billionaires shook hands, where deals were made in whispers, and where people like Maya Johnson weren't welcome. But Maya had no choice. She was 7 months pregnant, her belly round beneath her thin coat. Her shoes were soaked, her braids clung to her face, and her hands shook as she clutched a folder to her chest. She had worked here once. She had worn the uniform with pride. But all of that was gone now. "Ma'am, this is a private event. You can't stand here." Maya's voice trembled. "I used to work here. Please. I just need to speak to Mr. Whitmore. 5 minutes. Not tonight." But fate was cruel, because just then, Charles Whitmore himself descended the marble staircase. White, mid-50s, tall and broad in his tailored tuxedo. His silver hair slicked back, his smile smug as he basked in the applause of donors. He froze when his eyes landed on her. And then, he laughed. "Well, well. Look who crawled back." The crowd turned, their curiosity piqued. Maya stood there, drenched and trembling, her belly an undeniable reminder of her condition. "Mr. Whitmore. Charles. Please. I worked for you. I gave everything. And when you fired me, you left me with nothing. I'm carrying a child. I need help." Charles smirked, adjusting his cufflinks. "You need help? You should have thought about that before refusing me. Before embarrassing me in my own office." Gasps whispered through the crowd. Maya's cheeks burned. She had rejected his advances, and he had made her pay. "I did nothing wrong. You know that." Charles's eyes hardened. "What I know is this, the Langford Hotel is a place of class. Not a shelter for girls who don't know their place." He turned to security. "Get her out of here." The guards stepped forward, gripping her arms. The folder slipped from her grasp, scattering papers into the puddles. Maya struggled. "Please. I'm begging you. I have nothing left." The guests laughed. Some shook their heads. Others sipped champagne, entertained by the spectacle. Charles raised his glass in mock toast. "Ladies and gentlemen, a lesson. Success favors the strong. And weakness belongs outside." The guards dragged her through the rain, tossing her onto the curb. Her knees scraped the concrete, her belly jolted. She cried out, clutching herself protectively. The red carpet soaked in rain. The glowing hotel sign towered above her like a taunt. Maya's chest heaved with sobs. And then, a hand. Lena, her best friend since childhood, ran to her side, umbrella trembling in her grip. "Maya. Oh my God, are you okay?" Maya shook her head, teeth chattering. They laughed. They treated me like garbage. And my baby." Lena crouched, pulling her into a hug. "They don't decide your worth. Look at me. They don't decide your future." Maya pressed her hand against her belly. The baby shifted inside her, strong, alive. She whispered through tears. "They think we're nothing. But one day, you will walk through doors they slammed in our face. One day, you will make them remember my name." Her voice cracked, but her eyes burned with fire. "You'll raise him strong. Smarter than them. Better than them." Maya nodded, gripping her belly. "Isaiah. That will be his name. And he will be my justice." Rain poured harder, drowning out the laughter still echoing from the hotel. Back inside, Charles basked in praise. Guests patted his back, chuckling. Good riddance. These people think they can beg their way into our world. She'll learn. Life is survival of the fittest. Always has been. But as he lifted his glass once more, he had no idea that the very boy growing inside that humiliated woman, would one day sit in judgment over him. Outside, Maya and Lena walked slowly into the night. Maya shivered, soaked to the bone, but her voice whispered steady as a prayer. They will see us again. Not as beggars. Not as victims. But as something they can never break. She clutched her belly tighter. The screen lingers on her face, broken yet unbowed. On that night of humiliation, Maya Johnson was left with nothing. But she also found something priceless, the resolve to raise her son into the weapon of justice she could never be. And the man who mocked her would one day stand in a courtroom, begging for mercy from the very child he once left in the rain. Maya Johnson left that night at the Langford Hotel carrying not only the sting of humiliation but also the heavy burden of survival. The rain had soaked her clothes, the laughter of the wealthy still echoed in her ears, and the image of Charles Whitmore's smug face burned into her memory. Yet she walked into the darkness with Lena by her side and with a child inside her who represented hope. The years that followed were grueling. Maya gave birth to a boy in a city hospital ward, alone except for Lena's comforting hand. She named him Isaiah. His first cries in that cold room were the beginning of her silent revolution. She swore that her son would never bow to the cruelty she endured, that he would never be broken by the sneers of men like Charles Whitmore. Motherhood was not easy for a single black woman with no savings, no safety net, and no powerful name to protect her. She took cleaning jobs during the day, scrubbing office floors and hotel lobbies that once dismissed her presence. At night, she worked as a waitress, carrying heavy trays until her back ached and her hands blistered. Every cent she made went to keeping a roof over Isaiah's head, food on the table, and second-hand clothes on his growing frame. The apartment they lived in was small and dim, with leaky ceilings and the constant hum of traffic outside. Maya learned to patch leaks with buckets and tape, to stretch meals out of rice and beans, to mend shoes so Isaiah could wear them for another year. There were nights when she went without food so that her son could eat. Yet she never complained. Every sacrifice was a seed planted for the future. Isaiah grew under her watchful eyes, absorbing her strength like a sponge. From the beginning, he was different. As a toddler, he would line up his toys with precision, study books with curiosity far beyond his age, and ask questions that startled his teachers. He learned to read before most of his peers, and by the time he entered grade school, he was at the top of his class. Though brilliant, Isaiah never forgot the shadows his mother carried. He watched her come home exhausted, sometimes limping from long shifts, her fingers raw from chemicals, her clothes smelling of bleach and frying oil. He noticed how neighbors looked at her with pity, and how strangers ignored her presence. Those unspoken slights etched themselves into his heart. Each one became fuel for a determination he didn't yet understand. Adolescence was a storm for Isaiah. At school, wealthier classmates mocked his worn shoes, his second-hand backpack, and the fact that his mother worked as a cleaner. Some called him names, others excluded him from social circles. Teachers, recognizing his intellect, praised him, but peers tried to drag him down with cruelty. Yet every insult, every laugh, reminded him of the vow his mother made the night she held him in the rain. He found solace in books. Law, history, philosophy, he devoured them. While others wasted afternoons in idle play, Isaiah sat in libraries, memorizing legal cases, understanding systems of justice, and studying leaders who rose from oppression to power. He read about civil rights icons, lawyers who fought against impossible odds, and judges who reshaped nations with their rulings. Slowly, his purpose crystallized. Maya nurtured his hunger for knowledge, even when it meant working extra hours to afford old textbooks from second-hand stores. She never stopped reminding him of the dignity she wanted him to embody. She taught him that anger could burn bridges, but discipline could build empires. She instilled in him the value of patience, reminding him that revenge was fleeting but justice was eternal. At 16, Isaiah stumbled upon the truth of his mother's humiliation. He had heard fragments whispered by neighbors, but that night she told him the entire story. She described how Charles Whitmore had mocked her, how he had ordered her out into the rain while she carried Isaiah in her belly. She spoke with tears in her eyes but pride in her voice, because despite that humiliation, she had survived. For Isaiah, the story lit a fire. Anger surged in him, a desire to strike back at the man who caused his mother such pain. But Maya's hand calmed him. She reminded him of her vow, that they would rise not by fists but by intellect, not by vengeance but by transformation. Isaiah promised her that he would make her proud, not by bringing shame, but by bringing justice. His path became clear. He poured himself into academics, pushing his grades higher, winning competitions, excelling in debate. Teachers praised him as one of the most promising students they had ever seen. Scholarships opened doors, and Isaiah walked through every one of them with his mother's face in his heart. When he graduated high school, Maya cried openly in the auditorium as his name was called for every award. When he delivered his first speech as class valedictorian, the audience rose to their feet, and Maya whispered under her breath that the world was only beginning to see what her son was capable of. College was no less grueling. Isaiah balanced part-time jobs with rigorous studies, often surviving on little sleep and cheaper meals. Yet his brilliance carried him forward. He majored in political science, then law, his reputation as a sharp and relentless student growing with each passing semester. Professors noticed him. Judges noticed him. Opportunities opened. Meanwhile, the world of Charles Whitmore remained gilded on the surface but corroding beneath. His empire stretched across hotels and luxury apartments, his name appeared in magazines, but whispers of his corruption spread. Tenants complained of being evicted unfairly, workers spoke of exploitation, and business rivals hinted at fraud. Charles silenced them with money and influence, but the cracks widened. Isaiah graduated from law school with honors, one of the youngest in his class to pass the bar. Maya, wearing her best dress despite its age, stood in the front row with Lena, tears streaming down their faces as he took his oath. For Isaiah, that moment was not just the beginning of his career, it was the continuation of his mother's vow. Each milestone became a silent victory against the humiliation that birthed him. Each case he studied, each courtroom he entered, was a step closer to the reckoning he silently promised Maya. She watched him rise with quiet pride, her heart swelling each time someone addressed him as counselor or sir. But Isaiah was not simply chasing success for himself. He remembered every child in his neighborhood who was mocked for their poverty, every family displaced by greedy landlords, every worker dismissed without dignity. He carried their stories alongside his mother's, weaving them into the foundation of his purpose. By his early 30s, Isaiah was no longer just a lawyer. He was a rising star in the legal world, known for his sharp arguments and unshakable composure. He had earned the respect of his peers and the attention of powerful figures. His name carried weight, and his presence in the courtroom carried authority. It was then that fate began to turn. Charles Whitmore's empire, once unshakable, was finally crumbling under the weight of its corruption. Federal investigations circled. Lawsuits piled. And one case, the biggest of all, threatened to topple him completely. The stage was set for the confrontation that had been brewing for decades. The man who had thrown Maya Johnson into the rain would soon stand in front of her son, not as a conqueror, but as a defendant. The courtroom loomed on the horizon. Charles Whitmore still believed his wealth and power could shield him. He had no idea that the judge presiding over his fate would be the son of the woman he humiliated. Maya sat at her kitchen table one night, staring at Isaiah across from her. The glow of a desk lamp lit his face, now a man full of quiet strength. In her heart, she knew the moment she prayed for had come. Isaiah looked up from his files, his voice steady. "The fight you started that night. I'll finish." The courthouse stood tall, its marble pillars streaked with years of rain and history. Inside, the air was heavy with anticipation. The case that had captured headlines across the state was about to begin. Charles Whitmore, once untouchable, was now the accused. Time had not been kind to him. His once slick silver hair had thinned, his broad shoulders stooped under the weight of age and scandal. Yet arrogance still clung to him like a suit, pressed and expensive, as if appearances could still shield him from reality. He walked into the courtroom with his team of lawyers surrounding him, but the confidence in his eyes faltered the moment he looked up. Sitting at the elevated bench was Judge Isaiah Johnson. The resemblance to Maya was undeniable. The same dark brown skin, the same steady eyes that carried both pain and pride, the same quiet strength that spoke without words. He wore his black robe with dignity, and though his face was calm, there was power in his presence that silenced the room. Charles froze for a fraction of a second, the memory of rain and laughter from decades earlier flashing in his mind. He recognized those eyes. They belonged to the woman he had humiliated and discarded like dirt. But now they belonged to her son, and her son was the one holding the gavel. The proceedings began. Evidence was presented, documents laid out, testimonies given. Victims stepped forward one by one, each telling their story of exploitation at the hands of Whitmore Enterprises. Tenants described sudden evictions, workers spoke of unsafe conditions, contractors revealed unpaid contracts. Patterns of fraud, intimidation, and corruption unfolded with chilling clarity. The gallery was packed with reporters, families, activists, and former employees. Each revelation sent murmurs rippling through the crowd. The once celebrated millionaire was being stripped layer by layer until nothing remained but greed and cruelty. Isaiah listened intently, his face composed, his tone professional. But inside, the echoes of his mother's story rang louder with each testimony. He remembered her scraped knees on the sidewalk, her trembling voice as she told him how Charles had laughed at her pregnancy, her whispered vow that one day her son would bring justice. That vow had brought him here. Charles's defense team fought hard. They argued that his wealth had created jobs, that his empire had contributed to the city's growth. They painted him as a flawed but visionary man, misunderstood and unfairly targeted. But the weight of evidence pressed down heavier than their arguments could lift. The documents did not lie, and the witnesses spoke with unwavering truth. For Charles, the courtroom became a mirror he could not escape. He saw the faces of those he had crushed underfoot, faces he had ignored in pursuit of profit. He saw in Isaiah's eyes the reflection of the woman he had mocked in front of his peers, now reborn in the authority of her son. As the days passed, the tension built. Each hearing drew larger crowds. Headlines screamed about the downfall of a titan. And each time Charles glanced up at the bench, he was forced to face the irony of his fate. The son of Maya Johnson now sat in judgment over him. The confrontation reached its peak when a witness produced a letter, decades old, that tied Charles directly to discriminatory practices against black employees. The words were clear, signed in his own hand, dismissing entire groups of workers as unfit for luxury establishments. Gasps filled the courtroom as the letter was read aloud. The mask of respectability Charles had worn for years cracked wide open. Isaiah remained steady, his voice calm as he admitted the document into evidence. But behind his composure was the fire of decades of injustice, not just for his mother but for every person silenced by Charles's arrogance. The trial stretched on, but the outcome was becoming inevitable. Each day chipped away at Charles's defenses until even his most loyal supporters began to withdraw. His empire, once gleaming, now looked like a hollow shell built on exploitation and deceit. On the final day of testimony, Charles was called to the stand. He walked slowly, no longer the towering figure he once was. His voice trembled as he answered questions, his eyes darting nervously around the room. The arrogance had drained away, replaced by desperation. For the first time in his life, Charles Whitmore found himself powerless. Isaiah watched him, every detail burned into his memory. The man who had once raised a glass to mock his mother now struggled to defend himself under oath. The irony was sharp, but Isaiah held his composure. He was not here for revenge. He was here for justice. When the cross-examination ended, silence filled the courtroom. The weight of decades hung in the air. Isaiah looked down at the papers before him, then up at Charles. The gavel struck once. The court recessed before closing arguments. The crowd buzzed with anticipation, knowing that the verdict was near. Maya sat quietly in the gallery, her hands clasped together, her eyes fixed on her son. She saw not just the boy she had raised but the fulfillment of the promise she had made on that rainy night so long ago. The humiliation that once defined her was being transformed into power, and it was her son who carried it. Charles slumped in his chair, the reality sinking in. His empire was crumbling, his reputation destroyed, and his fate now lay in the hands of the very child he had once condemned before birth. The irony was complete, but the final judgment had yet to fall. The courtroom would reconvene for closing arguments and the verdict. Charles still clung to a shred of hope that money or influence might save him. But the gavel in Isaiah's hand carried something far stronger than wealth, it carried justice. The world held its breath as the final day approached. The final day of the trial arrived under a gray sky. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, their voices filling the air with chants for justice. Reporters lined the steps, cameras poised to capture the conclusion of a case that had come to symbolize more than one man's downfall. It had become a trial of power itself. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with restless energy. Every seat in the gallery was filled. Families who had been displaced by Whitmore Enterprises, former employees who had suffered under his command, and citizens who simply wanted to witness the end of arrogance sat shoulder to shoulder. The air was heavy, as if the walls themselves were waiting to exhale. Charles Whitmore sat at the defense table, his once pristine appearance now frayed. The lines on his face were deeper, his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his tie. The confidence he once wore like armor had shattered. He looked older, smaller, like a man finally cornered by the truth. Isaiah Johnson entered the courtroom in his black robe, carrying himself with a calm authority that silenced the room instantly. His presence was undeniable. To some, he was simply Judge Johnson. To Maya, seated quietly in the front row, he was still the boy she had raised in that dim apartment, the boy she had fed with sacrifice and steeled with love. To Charles, he was the living reminder of the night he thought he had erased a life with a smirk and a command. Closing arguments began. The prosecution painted a vivid picture of decades of exploitation, greed, and discrimination. They laid bare the suffering of countless families and the corruption that had allowed Charles to flourish unchecked. They spoke of arrogance, of cruelty disguised as business, and of the need for accountability. The defense clung to remnants of wealth as justification. They argued that Charles had created jobs, that he had contributed to the city's growth, that he was being unfairly targeted for his success. But their words fell flat against the mountain of evidence. Each claim felt hollow, disconnected from the truth laid bare before the court. When arguments ended, silence descended. The weight of decades of injustice pressed on every soul in the room. All eyes turned to Isaiah. He lifted the papers before him, but he did not need them. He had carried this verdict in his heart long before the trial began. His voice was steady, calm, but filled with the authority of a man who understood the gravity of the moment. He spoke of power misused, of people treated as disposable, of lives broken for profit. He spoke of the dignity denied to workers, of families cast out of their homes, of a system corrupted by greed. He reminded the room that wealth was not a shield against justice, that arrogance was not a crown, and that cruelty would always meet its day of reckoning. When his words reached their peak, he looked directly at Charles Whitmore. Their eyes locked. One pair trembling with fear, the other unwavering with truth. The gavel struck. Charles Whitmore was found guilty. The words echoed like thunder. The gallery erupted, cries of relief, gasps of vindication, applause from those who had waited years for this moment. Reporters scrambled, pens racing, cameras flashing. Charles's shoulders slumped. His head dropped into his hands. The titan who once strutted across red carpets and mocked the powerless now sat broken, his empire in ruins, his legacy in ashes. Maya wept quietly in the gallery, tears rolling down her cheeks. But these were not tears of sorrow. They were the tears of a woman who had carried humiliation in silence, who had been thrown into the rain with her dignity stripped, and who now watched her son deliver justice with dignity intact. Outside the courthouse, the world reacted. Headlines blared of Charles Whitmore's downfall. Families displaced by his greed held each other and cried. Workers who had suffered under his rule spoke of finally feeling seen. Activists hailed the ruling as a turning point, a message that power could not shield injustice forever. But Isaiah's victory was not only in the conviction. He used his ruling to create something greater. He ordered restitution funds for victims, mandated reforms for housing and employment, and pushed for new protections for marginalized communities. He turned his mother's suffering into a blueprint for systemic change, ensuring that what happened to her would never be repeated for others. When the trial was over, Isaiah stepped outside into the daylight. The crowd cheered his name, but he walked past them and straight to his mother. Maya stood waiting, her hands trembling as she reached for him. They embraced tightly. For a moment, the noise of the world faded. There was only mother and son, bound by years of struggle and sacrifice, standing in the light of justice finally served. Maya whispered softly, her voice breaking with emotion. She told him that on the night she was humiliated, she prayed for justice. She told him that God had answered her prayer through him. Isaiah held her close, his own eyes wet with tears, and told her that every step he took was because of her strength. The moment was more than personal victory. It was a symbol. The boy who had once been mocked before birth was now the man who commanded respect. The mother who had once been cast out in the rain was now honored through the dignity of her son's triumph. The man who had once laughed at their pain now sat condemned, his empire stripped away. The city would never forget the name Isaiah Johnson. And it would never forget the vow of Maya Johnson, the woman who turned pain into power by raising a son who stood for justice. True strength is not in vengeance but in rising above. Maya's humiliation became the soil from which Isaiah's greatness grew. Charles Whitmore's arrogance ended in disgrace, but Maya's perseverance ended in justice. This story reminds us that the greatest revenge is not destruction, it is dignity, success, and justice that heals more than one wound. What about you? Have you ever had to rise above someone who tried to tear you down? Share your story in the comments below. If this story moved you, don't scroll away. Subscribe to Echoes of Black Struggles for more stories of resilience, transformation, and justice. Share this video with someone who needs hope today. Because no matter the struggle, victory is always possible.